Firstly, welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I'm pretty certain I know everyone who's on the call so far, but I'm Andrew State, the CEO and Managing Director of the Pinnacle Foundation, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's session on the context and history of the Voice to Parliament to help inform the Pinnacle family. Today's session is being recorded, and for those who are joining us, you'll see the Q&A function has been enabled. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we are all meeting today. Today, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations people joining us here today. It is my great pleasure to introduce Adam Lees and David Allinson. Adam is a non-executive director of the Pinnacle Foundation, and he has over 20 years of experience in the mining and energy sectors, working in senior leadership roles. Adam was raised in the remote mining town of Mount Isa in Queensland. He's an Australian of Irish, English, and Filipino heritage, and is also a descendant of the Meriam people of Murray Island, Mer, in the Torres Strait, and the Yadagana people of Cape York. A published author and storyteller, Adam's co-authored book, A Question of Colour, My Journey to Belonging, was shortlisted in the New South Wales, the Western Australian, and the Queensland Premier's Literary Awards. David Allinson has 15 years' experience in Indigenous affairs. He is an ex-co-chair of Reconciliation Queensland. Professionally, David is an Australian lawyer and has taught constitutional law and Indigenous rights at universities in Australia and in the UK. David has been involved in the national conversation about the Voice to Parliament since 2015. He is passionate about facilitating compassionate and informative conversations about reconciliation in Australia. Adam, David, welcome to you both. I'll now hand over to you for this session, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks everyone for joining us. We really appreciate you giving up an hour of your time, and really we want to make this session about you. So thank you for that very generous introduction. As Andrew mentioned, I'm Adam Lees. I have been working in Indigenous affairs and sort of related roles for about 25 years, but I'm much older than I look. I grew up, I was born in 1972 at a time in the wake of the civil rights gains and the aftermath in Australia that really recognised Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the Commonwealth level for the first time. Prior to that, we had been not counted and excluded from being counted in the census. Importantly, the 1967 referendum allowed the Commonwealth to legislate and make special laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which prior to that was really led by the states on an individual basis. I grew up witnessing a lot of the great activism, particularly by my mother in those early periods, and seeing the tremendous power of the people, and again the civil rights gains that were achieved in the 1970s, from the introduction of the Land Rights Act through to the Anti-Discrimination Act. And I also do have to pay tribute to countrymen. Many of you would be familiar with the 1992 Mabo High Court challenge, and it was I'm a beneficiary of that tremendous legacy. It was my two relatives, James Rice and Dave Passy, who took that case to conclusion in the High Court after the lead plaintiff, Eddie Kawiki Mabo, had passed some months prior to the judgment being delivered in Canberra in 1992. And that particular ruling was a watershed legal and social revolution here in Australia. What we're going to do, I'll tag team with David. We're very accustomed to presenting generic information about the referendum. We really want to make this about you and would love to hear from you, and feel free to use the Q&A panel to throw some questions at us. Now is a really pivotal moment in the referendum. Although the referendum day is the 14th of October, the early polling has actually opened, I believe, as of yesterday, and people are now eligible for postal votes in advance of the 14th. So effectively, we are at the foot of the referendum. We're not here, and I think just wanted to sort of pitch very early that we're not here to tell you how to vote. This is a generic information session, but what we do want to do is provide you with some accurate information to ensure that you're fully informed, or give you the opportunity to have any questions that you need answered. I also want to recognise the particular personal challenge that the current referendum and some of the behaviour in the debate that we've seen is almost a repeat of what many of us saw and were impacted by during the marriage plebiscite. We know that misinformation, really sort of hostile and negative commentary, has a profound impact on our well-being and mental health. And so for those of us who identify both as LGBTI and Indigenous, it feels like a bit of a deja vu and a re-traumatising all over again. So I just wanted to acknowledge, if there are other people like myself who identify as LGBTI and Indigenous, it's important that we take care of ourselves through the current period. I guess what before we sort of take you through some further information, and David will talk about the Uluru Statement in general and its origins, there's a few things I just wanted to let you know. I wanted you to know that the call for greater rights and recognition by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is not something new. One of the earliest petitions that was presented to Queen Victoria was in March 1847. And that was a petition that was presented by 6 Tasmanian Aboriginal people who petitioned Queen Victoria to ask the Crown to observe the promises that had been made to them. And they wanted the Crown to observe the commitments made to them as Indigenous people. With 86, there was a petition from the Corranderk community in Victoria seeking intervention by the government to protect Indigenous rights and interests. Fast forward through to 1937, famous Yorta Yorta leader William Cooper was the first person to represent a group of Aboriginal people who wanted to petition, who actually petitioned King George V, demanding dedicated seats in the Commonwealth Parliament for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Many decades later, it was Kim Beazley, the former politician, his father, in 1959, led nationwide consultations and engagements right across the country on behalf of the Commonwealth, seeking input and feedback on that very matter, wanting support to dedicate Indigenous seats in Parliament. And that still, as we know, didn't go anywhere. Again, in 1963, we saw the Yolngu people from Arnhem Land petition the Commonwealth Government on mining rights and approvals through the Yirrkala Bark petitions. And that movement was actually the first time that an Indigenous movement, an Indigenous petition, had been formally accepted by the Commonwealth Government. At the same time, we had the 1967 referendum, which I had mentioned was groundbreaking and a positive action in this country that really provided the pathway to equality and equity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in their own country. This was followed by the Larrakia Bark petitions in 1972, the 1988 Barunga Statement, and then in 2012 to 2017, through the establishment of the Recognise campaign that was run by Reconciliation Australia, which provided really the foundation for the current call for constitutional recognition and greater rights for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So with that was born on the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I'll hand over to David to take you through what the Uluru Statement of the Heart was really about and how it's led to where we are today with the current referendum. Thanks. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Adam. So there's a lot of conversation at the moment about the Uluru Statement, and the reason for that is that the current proposal for an Indigenous voice to Parliament and executive government is that it came from the Uluru Statement. As Adam mentioned, though, there has been a tremendously long and hard-fought battle for recognition in Australia by Indigenous people themselves. And so I think it would be a mistake to sort of just point to the Uluru Statement and say, you know, that's where the voice comes from. As Adam has pointed out, Indigenous people have been asking for a say in their own affairs for a very long time. But the Uluru Statement was actually the culmination of 13 regional dialogues. So there were these regional conversations that happened throughout Australia from about 2017. And what they culminated in was one national convention at Uluru with the delegates, who then set out what they felt were the key points, the highlights, and the main ask that arose from each of those regional dialogues. Now, there's quite a lot of misinformation about what the Uluru Statement actually is. There's debate about how long it is, etc. I encourage you to simply Google the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and it is one page, and what you see is what you get. And the Uluru Statement asks fundamentally for a more respectful conversation to occur between Indigenous peoples in Australia and the Australian Parliament. And it asks for this in three ways, three key things. A voice, so for Indigenous people to have a say in the laws and policies that are made about them on their behalf and without their input. Secondly, a treaty-making process and a truth-telling program to underpin each of those, because whatever progress you make in legal frameworks or institutional frameworks is not going to be as effective if it's not underpinned by a really strong understanding and a mutual understanding of what's occurred in Australia, so that we can move forward together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together, with a mutual sense of who we are, where we've been, and where we want to go to. So the Uluru Statement asks for these three things: a voice, treaty, and truth. And it was by far the most representative, consultative process in history with Indigenous peoples. The fact that it landed at a consensus position among all of the delegates, bar I think 3 who left on the second day because of a view that the voice agenda was moving ahead of the treaty agenda. But for there to be that level of consensus in any community, let alone among 300 plus Indigenous nations, is pretty formidable. So the weight of the Uluru Statement bore quite heavily, I think, on the Australian government. The Turnbull, it was delivered in 2017, and the Turnbull government actually rejected the Uluru Statement in 2018, which was a pretty devastating blow. But the Albanese government in 2023 has since picked up that baton and has decided to now take it to a referendum. A referendum is a pretty unique feature of Australia's democracy. There are very few countries that actually have direct democracy involving the will of the people or requiring the will of the people to change the constitution. But on the 14th of October, everybody will be asked to vote. So in order for the proposal to pass, what we need is what's called the double majority. We need a majority of people in a majority of states and also an overall majority in order for the proposal to pass. And the proposal is very simple. The proposal is, should there be, or do you support the insertion of words in the Constitution to the effect of, there shall be a body called the Voice to make representations to the Parliament and executive government. Now, in question time, we can maybe get into why it is such a threadbare inclusion. Why is there no detail? Why is there no legislation in the constitutional amendment? There are very reasonable questions there, but also very practical responses. So I think that's about where I wanted to get to with that point. I don't want to talk too much because Adam and I discussed we really want to make this about you, where your interests lie, and so if you have any questions at this point, please pipe up. Otherwise, we'll continue providing you with prompts and information.
Yeah, I think, David, one of the things we can discuss, and I'll throw to you on, is some of the misinformation we hear is, for example, that the Uluru Statement is akin to a declaration of war. And there's been some, fabulous claims around it will be the precursor to Aboriginal people taking people's land or taking scholarships or somehow asserting all these special rights and interests. What do you say sort of in response to that?
I mean, it's bizarre. I think you're talking about Warren Mundine's saying that it was an affront to contemporary Australia or something like that. I mean, I don't see things that way. I mean, the Uluru Statement fundamentally is it's grounded in a Yolngu concept from northeast Arnhem Land called Makarrata. So the word Makarrata was gifted by the Yolngu people to this process, and Makarrata means coming together after a struggle. Now, for Warren Mundine to go from a desire to genuinely reconcile, to come together after a struggle, to then describe that as an affront to contemporary Australia, I find truly bizarre, especially when we have the groundworks for such an incredible opportunity. You mentioned, Adam, that this is a political moment. It's a moment where non-Indigenous Australia can embrace, I think, a very reasonable and actually quite modest request. So the idea that this will involve land rights, I mean, I don't even really know where to start with some of those sort of weird assertions that it will involve discussions of, suburban, having people's, backyards taken, how it's going to have to do with scholarships and things like that. I mean, it's hard to know how to exactly start responding to those things other than to say there is absolutely nothing in fact to suggest that the Voice will have any power to regulate those things at all. The proposal is for Parliament, indeed, to set up the legislation that will flesh out what the Voice's powers and influence will look like. But it's an advisory body. At the end of the day, it's Parliament that retains the power to regulate each of these areas. And so if any of those changes are going to occur, they will be acts of the Australian Parliament. So, particularly to that point about it being an affront to contemporary Australia, I think it's really it's unfortunate that it doesn't really seem to be a statement made in good faith, and I would suggest that it's sort of somebody trying to gain attention for themselves.
Yep. So at the heart of it, it really is acts in an advisory capacity and makes representations to Parliament. It doesn't make decisions on budget. It doesn't hold a budget itself. So effectively, it is there to have a say on policy making and on the decisions that impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and ultimately to have a say on government initiatives and activities that are, aimed at addressing that historical disadvantage. And it's also aimed at recognising the unique position of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia who have a continuing connection of more than, scientifically demonstrated 65,000 years to the Australian continent. And at the heart of it, that's all it is, nothing more or less. And I think it's such a modest proposal that anyone would be forgiven for thinking was so much more based on what we, read about or hear about, either in the media or within particular circles. And the Prime Minister himself took to social media and said that, with the billions and billions of dollars that's spent on Indigenous affairs in this country, it only makes sense and stands to reason that the people at whom that funding is targeted have some sort of a say around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I have thoughts, but we have a question in the Q&A.
Fire away.
Adam, what can non-Indigenous people do to help inform the discussions and debates?
Yeah, I think it's really important. That's a great question, Madeline, is just take the time to read and understand from credible check sources, and then I think become an active ally. We know that it's very difficult, and I think there's probably not one of us in the room who hasn't maybe had a tough conversation. When I sort of cast my mind back to what it was like during the marriage plebiscite, the power of allyship was so important to getting that outcome across the line. And it's certainly, as an Indigenous person and being 3% of the population, we're relying on the generosity of allies and supporters to help do some of the heavy lifting and to have the tough conversations, which will hopefully carry this through. I don't necessarily believe everything that I read. I have this little fire of optimism in my heart that common sense will prevail, and that fair-minded and reasonable Australians will take the time to fully understand and make the right choice about the future of this country. So I think there's things that you can do to be a good ally and to help spread the word and pay it forward, much in the same way that we relied on that generosity through the marriage plebiscite. So I would say that's one thing. David, over to you.
No, that's absolutely right, Adam. It is principally listening, but it's also about engagement. It's how you engage with people. It is, as you said, Adam, it's a very difficult time for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, whose lives are always political, but particularly at this point, being asked constantly, how are they going to vote? How are you going to vote? How are you going to vote, Adam? How many questions do you get that? How many times do you get that question a day? It's being mindful of that additional cultural load and political load on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Checking in with them if you have people in your friends and professional networks, to see what you could do to support, and not necessarily putting pressure on them to explain their view or to disclose how they're voting. And particularly with non-Indigenous people who are maybe strong no voters, to ask why. And so if they say something like, oh, the Uluru Statement is 300 pages long and they're keeping secrets from us, and it's like, well, why do you think that? Can you explain to me, like, point me to, I'm really interested in this information, point me to where, have you read the Uluru Statement, for example? Because everybody who I talk to who has this view has never read the Uluru Statement. And so I actually just bring it up on my phone and I say, dude, look, it's one page. It is literally one canvas. I have a copy of it in my house.
Yeah, I lost connection as well, so I'm not sure of the wee slide. But yes, you were saying about the Uluru Statement, you've got a copy of it in your house, and it is quite a simplistic, well-crafted proposal. Yeah,
which so you can ask those questions with compassion and genuine curiosity, and not be patronizing about it, because a lot of it is it's unfounded. It's a lot of the information out there is really poor quality. And I say that about the no case material. I do also have to say about some of the yes case material. A lot of it is actually not striking at things that are factual. A lot of it is emotive, and I think that is challenging for some people who are maybe more technical minded and want more details and facts. So we should be asking these questions, of everybody who has a very strong view and is trying to impose it on other people. A healthy democracy is predicated on the ability for us to have respectful and compassionate conversations with each other about why we hold certain views.
Now, so we discuss, and we have seen, quite often in us doing the rounds and having conversations with people, is I want to sort of draw out your experience from a constitutional law angle. One of the things that we hear is that it will divide us. Having a voice will divide us. And often people aren't aware of the current race provision that exists in the Australian Constitution. So for the benefit of people on the call, can you explain what currently exists in the Constitution and sort of maybe refer to that in terms of the arguments and, some of the criticism that's put forward by others around that division?
Yeah. I mean, so one of the most common articulations of this point is this will divide us. And I've even seen on a lot of the no case billboards outside the polling stations that this is racist, that this will divide us along the lines of race. And the fundamental problem with that is that we are already divided very much by race. And I don't mean that in a philosophical or social sense. I mean that in a really practical legal sense. So part of the amendments that went through in 1967 and elements of the Constitution before that set out in the Constitution what Parliament can and can't do. That fundamentally is what the Constitution does. It's not a book that sort of sets up representation and fairness. It allocates power within Australia between the three arms of government. And so for Parliament, it sets out the heads of power. So what are the things that Parliament can do? And one of those heads of power, Section 51, subsection 26, is the race power. And so that race power allows Parliament to make laws for the betterment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And this is the power that Parliament uses, for example, when it wants to, make more or less invasive social changes in Indigenous communities. So, for example, cashless welfare cards, alcohol management plans, and some of you might remember the 2004 to 6 Northern Territory intervention. These are things that normally would be racially discriminatory, but the suspension of the Racial Non-Discrimination Act is allowed because Parliament has this special race power. Now, the problem is it's not used well. These laws are almost always ineffective. They're always expensive for taxpayers. And one of the reasons for that is Indigenous people are never asked what they think about these laws. And that's part of the call for a voice for Indigenous people, is to balance out that inequality. When Parliament is making laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, those same people should have a say in what those laws look like. I mean, even if that doesn't resonate with you in your sense of natural justice, legally it will just make sense. And from a policy and from an accountability point of view, the idea is that it will improve the spending of public funds if we can, for example, save $250 million here or there without going on these ludicrous capers like the cashless welfare cards in Kununurra and Ceduna, which were famously ineffective. So constitutionally, the idea that we are all equal or all the same is just not true, even down to the way in which our system is divided. Because of population inequalities, a Tasmanian's vote is actually disproportionately like 10 or 12 times more valuable than someone from Victoria or New South Wales. The Constitution is not about equality. There's nothing in it that says we are all equal before the law. Like these are fictions that we take over from American politics and American constitutional culture. The Australian Constitution does not work like that. So the voice is something that's very particular, very adapted to the Australian environment. And it aims to simply address this one main imbalance. Indigenous people don't get a say in the laws and policies that are made uniquely for them. So, sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but I hope your order was quite tall. You were like,
no.
It's very specific.
General issue. And I think my other sort of comment, so sort of from a constitutional perspective, the race provision, confirms that inequality already exists, that there are special measures and provisions in our founding document that does discriminate, or where Parliament can discriminate positively and negatively, and introduce a range of programs and decisions that impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. From a sort of just a very base sense, while sort of fundamentally we might be regarded as equal, our life indicators and statistics confirm otherwise, that there's a huge inequality, massive gap in terms of life expectancy, in terms of access to education, in terms of access to housing, all those sort of negative social indicators that amalgamate through the closing the gap statistics, which we know that year on year haven't improved. And ultimately, the voices around being able to positively impact and change those outcomes for the better, closer to being equal. So I think it's kind of worth sort of highlighting that. Now, Greg, you've asked a question, and I think we can have quite a rich discussion on this. How do you respond to people who are thinking of voting no because they feel the current proposal doesn't go far enough? So I think there's recognition that there's different movements and different levels of support within the Indigenous community. Some people vote no because they believe it will override the sort of principle and concept of sovereignty. Others feel it's a symbolic symbolic change, and almost the voice being a bit of a toothless tiger in that it's not a decision-making authority. The response to that is that it's a start and it's a change to doing something fundamentally different, because history shows us that through the establishment of different advisory groups, throughout time, that they've been subject to, basically being cancelled or eliminated by the governments of the day for whatever reason. So different decision-making bodies like the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission and other sort of consultative groups that have been abolished by government over time. So fundamentally, this is a different step change. It is about ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will always have a voice in whatever format. And I think for me, this is the start of a broader conversation, and I think a broader movement as Australians around, well, how do we achieve that equality? How do we address the imbalance? How do we start to shift some of the indicators that I've kind of mentioned earlier? So it mightn't necessarily meet everybody's objectives, but it's certainly better than the status quo. And repeating and doing the same things over and over and not getting a different result. So I think it's incremental. I think the other thing as well, before I throw to you, David, for your view, is this is also sort of complementary of all the different activities that are taking place across the states and territories with their own moves to establish truth-telling commissions, like we see in Victoria with the Europe Justice Commission, the move by the Queensland government to establish a pathway to treaty as well as a truth-telling process. So effectively what we're seeing across the nation is a step change and a desire to do things differently. So that's how I see the voice. I think the only caveat I have when I do sort of engage people on the voice, it would be really simplistic to assume that the voice is going to be the silver bullet or the panacea or the problem-solving mechanism for all Indigenous issues. It will never be that, and we can't expect it to be that. But what I do see it as a step in the right direction to starting to address those issues by giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a voice. But David, you might have some alternative views or different views to build on that.
No, I think Adam, you've sort of covered the field in terms of what some of the positive objectives of the voice are. I mean, it's interesting to hear quite a lot of public conversation around a progressive no, right? This idea that a no can be progressive. But my question is sort of, well, what is it? To what end is it progressing? With regard to treaty, I mean, as Adam's pointed out, there are treaty processes underway. The idea of a national treaty has been on the table for more than 30 years and has made absolutely no progress. The idea of, and that's not to disparage the efforts of those advocates, it's simply to point out that this is not the voice jumping the queue, which is what I hear quite a lot. The voice has not jumped the queue. The voice has come into the conversation decades after. And the idea, I think, Adam, what you point out, sovereignty, that's probably the word that I hear a lot of. And I did years and years of doctoral research on sovereignty. But my views are not necessarily important. I think what is important is the words of the Uluru Statement itself. So the Uluru Statement itself points out that sovereignty is the basis of Indigenous peoples' connection to the soil. It says, or better, sovereignty. It's never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. And Mabo set out that while, recognition of Indigenous sovereignty would, in the words of Justice Brennan, sort of shatter the bones of the Commonwealth, it's very, very clear that nothing like that has happened, that sovereignties can coexist. And we're talking about two fundamentally different concepts, like the sovereignty that the Commonwealth is based on is an 18th century concept very much tied to polity, whereas Indigenous peoples' conceptions of sovereignty is very much more tied to a spiritual notion of a connection to country. these have existed and can coexist. The idea of this undermining Indigenous people's sovereignty is, I think it's scaremongering. And the fact that the Uluru Statement itself addresses it explicitly hasn't formed enough of the public conversation, I think. So the idea of a progressive no, I mean, it's important to be respectful and listen to why Indigenous people are concerned, especially given 230 years of government saying, hey, just, don't worry about it. We've got your best interests at heart. I think it's important to be mindful of where sometimes that progressive no is coming from.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we've got to bear in mind there, David, is, and we see it, as LGBTI people, they'll never be in any sort of setting, whether it's social or political, where you get 100% of people who agree on the same outcome. We saw that in the plebiscite. We know that there were people in our community who were opposed to, recognition of marriage equality for their own reasons. Whatever those were. Some felt that it was, being conformist, and some felt, well, it wasn't for them. And some might have even had their own, sort of religious views on that. And what we did see is that divergence, and that's certainly no different to the divergence that we see among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think one of the damaging aspects of the campaign has been that sort of public division and that very visible dissent and debate with Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people pitted against each other. I feel has been quite damaging. But at the heart of it, we've got to keep coming back to the fact that the polling and the research and the actions and the process demonstrate that this is something that the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have asked for and called for a very long time. And so I think we come back to that. I think the other thing, David, I wanted to touch on is this sort of notion of it being an elite concept, that it somehow won't, benefit people in regional and remote communities. I mean, I've got a couple of comments on that. I think the first thing is that we know that right across the country, from communities through to land councils, there's been overwhelming and very clear support for the voice. I think the other thing that I ask people to bear in mind is not to play into that sort of myth or the notion that the real Aboriginal people, the most disadvantaged ones, live in the far north or the nether regions of the country. From a demographic perspective, the most Sydney and urban centres are home to the most or the biggest populations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And in their own way, they also face disadvantage, hardships and difficulties, which often aren't given voice because they're somehow seen as having improved access, to facilities. But certainly the statistics show us that their outcomes, their quality of life, and all the indicators that I mentioned through Closing the Gap certainly aren't any different to people who live in remote areas. So my sort of view on that is that we're all in this together, and that try not to be fooled by this sort of notion that the voice of the people in the north and in remote areas is somehow more important. That's not to deny that access to services and those sorts of issues don't exist, but it shouldn't negate or kind of relegate the voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live in cities or urban areas, and that their voice counts just as much in this process. David, I'm not sure if you wanted to, we've got a question from Ben, which we can probably tackle together. If it comes to a no result this time, what do you see as the next step, and how we can best support First Nations communities through that outcome? I'll have a stab at that first and maybe throw to you. I think, Ben, that's a really good question and something I've tried really hard not to entertain or think about. A no result, I think, handing that question back to you, is how will it affect non-Indigenous Australia? It's actually about our shared journey, and I think a no result would be devastating, well, for all of us. But I think particularly, how will it reflect and how will it make non-Indigenous Australians feel? My sort of challenge recently, I was asked this very question in a forum last week, and my own personal view as an Indigenous person is, look, it will be, devastating. I think as a nation, we will get the result that we deserve. But ultimately, as Indigenous people, we'll be down, but we won't be out. And I countered that by saying, we've survived terrible atrocities. We've had land dispossessed. Over time, we know there's been massacres. We know that we've been subject to apartheid-like legislation. People like my own mother, lived and were placed on, and ancestors before them lived and placed on Aboriginal settlements and subject to different legislative and protection acts, presumably for their own good. We know that our children over time, have been removed. We've survived through that, and we will survive through this, and we will continue, to endure. But the sort of challenge is, I think it'd be a terrible setback for reconciliation. And the challenge is for all of us. How do we move forward together with what I think would be a terrible scar or a terrible taint on our nation's soul and on our psyche? I think so it's not just about Indigenous communities, it's about how we move forward together. David, what do you think from a non-Indigenous perspective?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that day after the referendum, and I've been thinking about it for many, many years. And if it's a no, I think the first thing I'll do after I've had, the cold shower of actually where are we at as a community, as Adam said, we'll get the result we deserve either way. I wanted to highlight a few opportunities, not to take away from, as Adam said, the scar that will be on our national pride from my point of view. But there are a few things to do. So I think the first will be mindful of the impact that it will have on your Indigenous colleagues and friends. Just hold them in your thoughts first and foremost. Think of ways of supporting them. Second of all is, while the Voice to Parliament is a big show, it is not the only show in town, and there are very many other vehicles for Indigenous people's rights that are still in play. So there is, as Adam mentioned, the Yurok Justice Commission in Victoria, various treaty-making processes going on in Victoria, Queensland, and elsewhere. There are also state-based Indigenous voices to state parliaments currently planned. There is native title compensation. There are the state-based human rights regimes. I could go on about this quite a lot. We will always, as Adam pointed out, reconciliation has survived many, many years of abuse, and it's about walking together and looking for the opportunities. And lastly, if you're interested in helping facilitate some of those opportunities, get involved in your local reconciliation organizations. There are state-based reconciliation entities, groups of like-minded people and fellow travelers. And there are also, of course, opportunities in your workplaces or organizations on whose boards you sit to be involved through their RAP committee or their RAP programs. So the next day, I think, is disheartening, but as Adam knows, and as anybody who works in Indigenous affairs for any length of time knows, part of the job is being resilient and getting used to disappointment and always just looking up over the horizon to see what other opportunities lie there. And fundamentally, as Adam said, there will always be people who have differing views or disparaging views or sort of splintering views. I think a guiding light will always be, what are the projects that actually bring us together as a community rather than divide us. So if it comes to a no result, there are probably those three things which I would do the day after the referendum.
Yeah, I'm hoping that, as it did with the referendum, that goodwill and the right choice will prevail. And I think I've often recounted the story. I spent 6 years in Africa and came back not long, as the referendum, the marriage plebiscite was heating up and that momentum was gathering. I'd been away a long time, and I really doubted that Australians would be generous enough and have enough care and goodwill to vote yes for us. And it was me who had to eat my words when that outcome came through. And I'm kind of hoping that that little miracle, or that big miracle, will also occur. I think for a lot of people who actively, want that change and want Indigenous people to have a voice and to be progressive, to even contemplate what a no would look like, much in the same way that some of us refused to or didn't want to contemplate a no for marriage equality. And ultimately, this is a decision that won't impact or won't be felt by a lot of non-Indigenous people, but it will make the difference to future generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. I just wanted to say that. So I'm still hopeful. I mean, it's hard not to be dismayed when you see or read some of the polls or the sort of content and some of the things people write. I try and avoid that, but I do have this, hope in my heart that goodwill will prevail. So we've got a question from Andrew.
Germaine to the point you just made, Adam.
Yeah, you can answer the polling question because I know this is one of your favourite topics that we sort of discuss regularly. So do we have any views on the key factors feeding into polling suggestion? And how we can, go on, far away.
As you well know, Adam, I am a firm believer that the pollsters have been radically wrong before in the 2020 federal election and with, the marriage equality plebiscite in 2016. They've been wrong before. I'm not suggesting that therefore they will be wrong again. But, eminent pollsters like Mark Textor have been pointing to some gaps in where the polling has been going. And just frankly, a lot of the media around this, I mean, it's really hard to find balanced reporting on the referendum. I'm not suggesting a sort of an unfounded conspiracy theory around the polls are all wrong. I'm just saying that they've been incorrect before, and so I'm not thinking about it. And every time I look outside at the numbers of people who turn up in capital cities to these rallies and the number of people who I know haven't been polled, I think I've met one person.
If you had a show of hands on the call today, how many of you have actually been polled or interviewed on the phone or rung up or, I think that would be quite telling. But in a lot of the sort of discussions I've had in the sort of the focus groups or sessions that we've been providing information, it's free as well. So I think that's important to highlight. So
yeah,
just take them with a grain of salt.
Yeah. I mean, should that change? And should that change how we behave? No. Should that change how what we're doing? Absolutely not. It's, to me, it's in some ways immaterial. And it could be designed to demoralize, to have the impact it's having, which is to demoralize people or to make them think that the cause is lost. But yeah, I'm skeptical that it's as dire as the polls suggest.
Yeah. All the more reason to vote yes for the underdog. So exactly.
We've got less than 10 minutes left, Adam. Should we sort of open this up for some more general conversation and questions?
Yeah, that'd be good. Feel free to ask tough questions as well. Happy to answer them. Otherwise, I think we might have done a good job and answered or addressed all the issues.
Well, I mean, one of the questions that I get quite a lot is, why does this have to be in the Constitution?
Yeah.
Why aren't we doing this in legislation first, and then and trialing it and then putting in the Constitution? And the reason for that is, as Adam said, there has been a very long history of advocacy for Indigenous people have a voice in their own affairs. And there's also been, in living memory, 5 different Indigenous advisory groups to government. And they've all been dismantled for political reasons, because the government of the day perceives it as being a creature of the other side, or they get the advice that they don't want, or they just don't want to fund it anymore. And so the constitutional guarantee is really, really important. It says, and the obligation will be on Parliament to always have the voice there, that Indigenous people will always have a say in their own affairs. And it's up to Parliament, it's up to the government of the day to flesh that out. And we haven't really had any questions about the design of the voice, but there is a list of design principles that I might share into the chat. I think it's really important for people to, can I put that straight into the chat?
Yeah, you should be able to just paste it into the chat.
All right.
I think the other thing, David, when we kind of sessions, you spoke about the number of groups that exist or that provide advice to Parliament, and it's something like more than 200 different groups that provide advice.
Yeah, I mean, if you count up all of the entities that have terms of reference that refer to the executive or Parliament, it's in the hundreds. None of them have the sort of constitutional status that we're talking about with the voice. But that's almost beside the point. The point is that this would be, as a mechanism of government, one source of advice in a very overpopulated ecosystem of creatures that already give advice. Advice on the price of grain, advice on the state of the Australian music industry, advice on our ball sport codes. Those are all real examples, by the way. And so the idea that people are scared of Indigenous people having an advisory body on Indigenous affairs when it's the second biggest budget allocation is just it's just ludicrous. And it does make me, I sometimes struggle with why people are so resistant to that idea. Yeah.
Thanks for popping that in chat. And I think the other thing that we can do, Andrew, if there's any other sort of neutral material, is include that at the end of the session or distribute it afterwards. Important is that people draw their own conclusions, but making sure that the information you're accessing is credible and fact checked. I think that's important. And we know that social media and some sites more than others don't lend themselves to being neutral or necessarily correct. So we've got the 5-minute countdown. So I guess opportunity for anyone to ask any last-minute burning question, or otherwise we'll invite Andrew to show himself and reappear, and we can close early and call the day.
Okay, I don't think we have any more questions. And Adam and David, on behalf of everyone who's on the call and the people who will watch this when we post the recording afterwards, thank you for taking the time to walk us through and share some insights. The Pinnacle Foundation has put a statement of support of the Voice to Parliament on the news page of our website, the Family Hub, and certainly, personally, I will be voting yes, with a very big yes. And Adam, when you shared, some time ago, the sentiment around hoping that people would consider voting yes, it certainly took me back to the time when we were hoping that our allies and colleagues would vote yes to allow marriage equality. And I hope that many people on the call today do everything they can over the next 10 or so days to really try and encourage people to get out and vote. And from my personal perspective, and I know from Pinnacle's perspective, we hope it's a yes. Thank you so much for making time, and I'm sure that everyone on the call would be incredibly grateful of the time you've spent with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, and really appreciate the opportunity, and vote wisely, and let's hope for the best.